You want to go closer? Open.
Good morning.
Hey, Emily.
Hello. Hi, Daniel.
Are you totally pumped? Where's the baby? Where's the baby?
What baby?
One
With my dad.
when you took from the hospital?
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everyone. We're waiting a few, get everyone on the line. Thanks for joining us. I think we're ready to begin. Good morning and welcome to the first meeting of the General Academic Institution Formula Advisory Committee. My name is Jennifer Gonzalez and I serve as Senior Program Director for the General Academic Institutions. Before we begin, I would like to ask the participants observe the following etiquette. Please state your name before you speak, mute your device when you're not speaking, and try to keep background noise to a minimum. We are joined today by Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board Commissioner, Dr. Harrison Keller. Dr. Keller will now provide an introduction and remarks. Welcome, Commissioner.
Thanks, Jennifer. And so welcome to all of you. And I want to say heartfelt thank you for your willingness to participate on this committee. Of course, this is one of our advisory committees that we're directed by statute to convene every 2 years. And the committee spends its time studying and providing recommendations on formula funding that ends up being an important input for deliberations in the legislative process, especially around appropriations. But the work that this committee will do in this interim, I think, is particularly important. There's a lot going on, of course, tremendous disruption across our campuses still due to the pandemic. I know through conversations with many of you how hard you're working on behalf of your students, on your campuses, and in your systems, and particularly in light of everything else that you have going on. I appreciate your willingness to serve on the committee and provide your input, your insights into these critical issues. Also, there's a lot going on at the agency, and in particular, as you may know, we're in the process of reviewing and updating our state 60x30 Texas goals. So, of course, the headline goal for 60x30 Texas is that by 2030, we would have 60% of our young working population to have some sort of post-secondary credential. The work that we've been engaged in over this past year or so to review and refine the goals is focused on 4 key areas. So first, broadening the focus of the goal beyond the traditional students to also include the hundreds of thousands of Texans who need to reskill and upskill to get back into the workforce or to advance in their careers as we see changes in our workforce needs much faster than anyone anticipated. So broadening that focus beyond the traditional age populations. Second, to push ourselves not just to talk generally in terms of increasing educational attainment, but to focus especially on the kinds of credentials that are going to be in high demand, that are already in high demand, that relate to current emerging workforce needs. Third, it's striking, and as I've discussed with many of you all, that our current higher education plan is entirely silent on the research and development mission of the institutions. That is increasingly critical. We have a governor who had set down a marker when he was a candidate that Texas should have multiple public research universities counted among the top 10 in the nation. The legislature has prioritized our research and development capabilities across our universities, yet our current plans are entirely silent on that aspect of your missions. So the steering committee in consultation with stakeholders across the state is considering how we might bring those considerations back into the plan. And finally, across all of our goals, to have a more intentional and visible focus on advancing equity. So we make sure that all Texans are going to have opportunities to participate in, benefit from, and contribute to our economic recovery. That work is currently underway. We're right now doing deep dive interviews with state and national experts, including the key stakeholders from major Texas employers right now. We've held virtual convenings with the assistance of many of your campuses and systems across the state, where we heard from more than 500 community leaders, educators, employers. We convened a statewide meeting, virtual meeting with national experts to reflect back some of those findings. And this is going to culminate in a summary recommendations that will be presented to our board in the October meeting, and then the new 60 by 30 plan will be rolled out in December. So the timing will coincide with work that you're engaged in with this committee. We want to make sure that that work and the data and the insights that come out of the 60 by 30 Texas work also cross-pollinate with your work. I would argue that part of our problem we have now, and a deep structural issue around our formulas, is that they're not well aligned with our state goals. So with your help, can we develop recommendations to improve that alignment? And at the very least, to make sure that we're not penalizing institutions when you're innovating student pathways, when you're streamlining transfer across institutions, and you're better aligning your programs with what the state really needs from higher education right now. Now, for those of you who've served on this committee before, are familiar with the process, you're going to see there's several charges that are familiar. So the usual charges around funding levels and formula inputs for general academic institutions. But there are a couple of additional areas that I did want to call out. First, that we have a charge around research to complement the work on the state goals. And so we're going to ask you all to consider and recommend, make recommendations around appropriation levels for the 3 research funds that are provided directly to institutions to support the important work that you do. And in addition, there was legislation that passed pertaining to financial support for our comprehensive regional universities, though that wasn't funded. Of course, our comprehensive institutions play a critical role and are really the backbone of our work in educating and graduating Texas students across the state. So we have a charge to study the proposed methodology for providing additional state support for institutions for students at these institutions, especially around their mission to educate at-risk students, help meet the state's workforce needs. And then we've included a charge to the committee to look at an issue I know many of you have been grappling with over the years, such as the impacts of the expenditure study and costs of online education in particular. And then finally, the last charge pertains to ways that as a state, we can create better alignment with our goals and opportunities with our finance system to support and incentivize your institutions as you're graduating students into the workforce in a timely manner with credentials of value. Now, we're not asking the committee in this compressed time frame to come up with a whole new funding model, but we are asking for your recommendations as you think through the current challenges that exist and identify areas where we can make progress or where there might be areas that warrant some further exploration. In particular, I'm concerned about our base year methodology, particularly as we see our economy start to pick up and enrollments start to pick up. But we've have our funding based on a snapshot of a base year that happened in a time of unprecedented disruption for our higher education institutions. So as our enrollments increase, I'm worried that the funding isn't going to be there to help support your institutions in meeting those students' needs. And finally, just on a personal note, as many of you know, prior to becoming commissioner, I actually had the opportunity to serve on this committee. So I know firsthand about the kind of work that you're being asked to do. And again, I want to say how much I appreciate your commitment to this work and your dedication for your institutions and on behalf of our state. Before I hand off the microphone, I would be happy to answer any questions you all might have for me.
Well, Commissioner, I think these are the best charges you've laid out as commissioner. So.
Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate the endorsement as these are my first charges that I've laid out for the Formula Advisory Committee. So we wanted to set the bar high the first time out.
Thank you, Dr. Keller. Oh, anybody else? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Commissioner, could you expand just a little on the first charge, increase in research support? So talk about, I know we have the two, the obviously the R1s, we have the emerging. Do you have some other thoughts and ideas around what you'd like to see as in a perfect world?
On the research support in particular?
Yes.
So it would be good to review what are the underlying methodologies and understand where there's points of friction, where we could improve the metrics that we're using to drive the funds to the institutions. So the state's gonna come a long way and gone through a process of making these funds more effective for the institutions. I really want to sort of toss it back to you all of when you reflect on the metrics, when you reflect on what's working and what's not, and that underlying methodology, as well as the funding levels, where do you think there are opportunities to make progress? And it doesn't have to be. So some of these could be just issues you identify where you say, okay, this is going to take some further exploration, but the trajectory of these conversations needs to go in this direction. That kind of thing would be fine. Any other questions for me? So if not, I will hand the conversation back over to Jennifer and to our convening chair. But thank you all again. I deeply appreciate your willingness to participate in this process.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to introduce Ms. Noelle Sloan, who served as chair for the fiscal year 22-23 committee that met 2 years ago. She will serve as the convening chair for this first meeting. Thank you, Ms. Sloan.
Good morning. I'd like to officially call the General Academic Institutions Formula Advisory Committee meeting to order. I also echo some comments that were already made and welcome the committee members and thank you for your attendance and continued service on this committee. I am Noelle Sloan from Texas Tech University, convening the meeting as the former committee chair. Please be advised that this meeting is being broadcast over the internet and recorded, so I would ask all attendees to silence your cell phones. Also, since we are meeting via Zoom, please mute your connection until you are ready to speak to prevent background noise. Thank you. Let's begin with roll call. Ms. Gonzalez?
Yes, Ms. Bonnie Albright.
Present.
I see. Okay. Dr. Lauren Blanchard,
Good morning, here.
Ms. Susan Brown,
Here.
Mr. John Davidson,
Yes, good morning. I'm here.
Miss Emily Deardor,
Here.
Mr. Joseph Duran. He is absent today, but Miss Laura Devine is listening in for him. Let's see. Mr. Daniel Harper,
I'm here.
Dr. Hurley,
Here.
Miss Veronica Mendez,
Good morning. Here.
morning. Mr. Tomlinson
Here.
and Miss Cruwell.
Here.
And to note, Ms. Cruel is nominated by Stephen F. Austin to replace Dr. Gallant, who recently retired. Until she's approved by the board as an appointed member with voting privileges, we have invited her to participate in the committee discussions. The quorum is present.
Thank you. Next, moving on to item 3 of our agenda is the election of a committee chair and vice chair. I'd like to open the floor for nominations of a committee chair. If you would like to nominate someone, please state your name for the record and your nomination.
Emily Deardorff. I'd like to nominate Daniel Harper as chair and Noelle Sloan as vice chair.
Okay, so Daniel Harper has been nominated for the position of chair, and myself as vice chair. Are there any other nominees? Okay. Seeing none, is there a second for the nomination?
This is Susan Brown and I second.
Will all those in favor please say aye?
Aye.
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 All opposed, same sign? Okay, the motion passes. Thank you.
All right, so we'll look forward to serving. And I think at this point, do we turn it over to Emily Cormier? Is she next on the agenda?
Yes, so I believe we've got a brief presentation to pull up. So as many of y'all know, we typically spend a few minutes at this first meeting just briefly reviewing the GAI formulas. And as you heard from the commissioner, he's asked y'all to look at the research funds provided directly to the institutions. So we've included a few overview slides on those as well, since that's a new item for this group to consider. So just to start with a few basics regarding the formulas. The formulas are designed to provide the legislature with a way to objectively allocate the funding available to institutions. Formula funding composes a significant amount of the appropriations you receive from the state, approximately 70%. And during session, the legislature divvies up the amount available for the formulas among the institutions using data that you submit to the coordinating board. This results in a rate for each formula depending on the applicable metrics, and the legislature sometimes or can include a consideration of enrollment changes and other factors in this decision making. Institutions directly receive formula funding as part of a lump sum appropriation, and this means that the way the formula funding is provided to an institution is not a requirement on how they must spend their state funding. We can move to the next slide. This slide just briefly shows the two formulas and the two supplements that provide funding for the general academic institutions, and all of which have different intended purposes. So the instruction and operations, or I&O formula, predominantly supports faculty salaries, department operating expenses, student services, and more. And this formula includes an add-on called the Teaching Experience Supplement that incentivizes the teaching of undergrad courses by tenured and tenure track faculty. The infrastructure support formula is intended to support the physical plant and facilities at institutions, as well as your utility costs. And lastly, smaller institutions receive what's called a small institution supplement to account for reduced economies of scale at those institutions. The next few slides will briefly cover the mechanics of these formulas. So for the first one, the I&O formula, this is driven by the semester credit hours taught. These hours are weighted to reflect differences in costs relating to teaching courses at different levels and in different fields. So for instance, it's expected that graduate courses are probably going to be taught in smaller sections, so they may be weighted more heavier than those undergrad courses. And then it may be more expensive to teach engineering than a course in history. The weighting is based on an expenditure study that's done annually by the coordinating board. And this is where expenditure data is collected and aggregated across the institutions to determine expenditures by discipline and level, and then those amounts are weighted relative to lower level liberal arts. After these semester credit hours get weighted, this amount is ultimately multiplied by the funding rate to come up with an institution's I&O share. And as I mentioned before, there's the Teaching Experience Supplement that's limited to those undergrad courses taught by those tenure track faculty, and those receive a 10% bump in the formula. We move to the next slide. We've got the infrastructure formula, and this is based predominantly on predicted square feet, which comes from the space projection model. This model is produced by the coordinating board on an annual basis, and it estimates the amount of space an institution needs by taking into account its semester credit hours taught, how many faculty they have, how much staff they have, the research expenditures, and other metrics. It's intended to be an equitable assessment of space needs at an institution. And the main point is that it's not at all related to actual square footage at an institution. So for the allocation of the infrastructure formula, it's based on that predicted square feet and then two rates. the operations and maintenance rate, and an institution-specific utility rate. Operations and maintenance rate is the same for all institutions and is intended to account for physical plant cost and maintenance. The utility rate is designed to account for the fact that each institution is subject to their local utility costs in their region. So a statewide utility rate is determined and then adjusted by school to account for those individual utility costs relative to other institutions. Moving to the next slide. The last component of the formulas is for institutions with a head count of less than 10,000 students. This supplement's intended to assist these smaller institutions with fixed costs, which are spread over fewer students. So institutions with an enrollment of less than 5,000 students receive 2.6 million for a biennium, and then that amount proportionally decreases as your headcount increases until you hit 10,000 students, in which case it phases out completely. You can see that 16 institutions received some form of funding from the small institution supplement during the 22-23 biennium. We move to the next slide. Finally, on this slide are the last two items I want to cover relating to the overview of the formulas. As the commissioner mentioned, the formulas for the GAIs use what's called base year data to determine appropriations for an upcoming biennium. Generally, the legislature just chooses to use whatever is the most recently available data relating to each of the drivers of the formulas we just discussed. So for the I&O formula, the base period is a 12-month period of semester credit hours taught. The final I&O appropriations use semester credit hours generated in the summer and fall of even numbered years and the spring of odd numbered years when the legislature is meeting. So to illustrate this, you can see on the left side of the slide that for the 22-23 biennium, that's based on semester credit hours taught during summer and fall 2020 and spring 2021. And the final point regarding the formulas is that the legislature uses an all funds methodology. And basically what this means is that formula general revenue provided to institutions is offset by the amount of other educational and general income or general revenue dedicated funding available to institutions for the formulas. General revenue dedicated funds include specific tuition and fee revenues such as statutory resident and non-resident tuition collections. And the Legislative Budget Board uses data provided by institutions to estimate how much will be available to institutions in an upcoming biennium. You can see on the right side of the slide that about 3/4 of formula funding comes from general revenue and about the remaining from the estimated statutory tuition and fee collections. Moving to the next slides, I'll cover briefly what happened in the last legislative session. So this slide is just intended to show a couple biennia worth of history regarding the all funds appropriations to each of the different formulas and supplements. And I would note that this is all funds, so that includes both general revenue and general revenue dedicated that I just mentioned on the prior slide. And so across all the formulas and supplements, there was an increase of approximately 300 million or 6% from the 2021 biennium. And I would also note that this doesn't include the 5% reduction taken by the general academic institutions in the 2020-21 biennium, since those amounts could have come across anywhere in the appropriations. Moving to the next slide. And this slide shows how much formula general revenue has been provided to institutions over the last few biennia. And so the previous slide showed that the all funds has been increasing each subsequent biennium. And however, this one shows that the GR in the formula does vary with its dip in 18-19. So the amount of formula funding provided by the legislature only provides part of the story, as it doesn't consider how much schools receive as the number of students served increases. So moving to the next slide, we've included just a summary of the rates for the I&O formula and the infrastructure formula. So you can compare the funding to the metrics driving those formulas to see how much institutions are receiving when accounting for the growth in the student population served. So here you can see during last session, the infrastructure rate was maintained and there was just a slight dip in the instruction and operation rate. This is my last slide relating to the formulas, so I'll transition now to the research funds. So there are 3 research funds directly provided to the GAIs: the Texas Research University Fund, the Core Research Support, and Texas Comprehensive Research Fund. So I should note that these are not all the state-funded programs to support research at the general academic institutions, as we're not including things like the NREF, the Governor's University Research Initiative, or TRIP. Those ones do not really function like a formula methodology as much as these three funds that are directly provided to the institutions do. So statute defines both the allocation methodology for the funding and the institutions that are eligible to receive funding from each of these. You can see here that the three funds are intended for different groups of institutions, but each are based on similar research metrics. All use some form of research expenditure data generated over the 3 years prior to when the legislature is meeting. Moving to the next slide. This slide just shows the historical funding for the three research funds since their inception in the FY 16-17 biennium. For this last biennium, approximately 280 million was appropriated across the three funds, maintaining the level of funding appropriated in 2021, and again, not accounting for the 5% reduction. Since the funds were established, appropriations have basically remained flat with just a slight dip in 18-19. However, over the same time period, research expenditures have been increasing across all of the institutions. We move to the next slide. So now that we've covered the formula and the research funds, I just have a brief overview of the timeline of the formula funding recommendations that you've been brought here to consider. So obviously the process is starting now with these meetings in the fall. And then in the spring, these committee recommendations will go to the commissioner and ultimately to our board to approve final recommendations. And those recommendations must be sent to the LBB and the governor's office by June 1st. And just a note, the preliminary base year will start with institutional reporting next spring, and then the final base year will begin in the summer. We use the preliminary data to provide information to the LBB and governor's office in the fall of 2022. And then we'll replace the spring 2022 data with the more updated data in spring 2023. And so on the last slide, we've just ended with the charges that you've been tasked with by the commissioner. And so at this point, I'm happy to take any questions, or I can turn it back to the chair for the next agenda item.
Emily, you're gonna put these on the coordinating board's website, correct?
We can do that, or we can send it to the committee.
Yeah, I imagine most people will want it either to use it for this, but also to reference it for some other presentations they may or may not be doing in the future.
Okay.
All right. So I guess if there's no questions, we should probably just talk through.
I do have one question, if you don't mind. When I look at this is Lauren Blanchard. When I look at the charges here and I correlate that with the statement that we just heard from our commissioner of areas there where he wants us to really focus. And one of those was the advancement of equity. I'm just wondering, and we don't have to answer it today, but to what extent do we see the equity focus reflected in these charges?
So Emily, you want to try for that, or I'm happy to offer some thoughts.
Feel free, and I can chime in if needed.
So I would think if you're talking about global equity, so, ensuring that higher ed as a whole is treated well, the first charge to me, and then, correspondingly the third charge goes in that direction. If you want to talk about trying to focus on the regional universities, charge 4 will, I think, help drive an equity with respect to the funding levels. And then also when you want to think about equity from a student perspective, charge 5 will, I think, provide an opportunity to talk about it from that perspective. And then charge 2 with the online adjustment may provide a way to talk about equity among either your field of study or your modality that you're in. So that's how I would kind of, I think.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
All right. All right. So there's no questions. Jennifer, do we historically just kind of read through the charges, or do we?
Yes, just kind of bring up each charge individually if y'all want to discuss them in particular, or if you want to discuss how y'all will tackle addressing them.
So before we do that, I would suggest that some of these charges are probably well suited to talk about as the whole, but some of these charges and portions of the charges may be better if we establish some subcommittees, a small subcommittee to work on this and bring the group back, kind of more of a straw man proposal, if you will, to talk about collectively. So obviously our first charge is the traditional charge, where it's the recommendation of the appropriation level. Well, one thing that was added is a fairly technical aspect, and that's on the infrastructure formula, how the split between the utilities and the O&M continue to, while they used to be similarly almost 50-50, there's now a spread to that. To me, that is something I think we can cover as the large group. Charge 2, I would think that's going to be better benefited in a small group discussion to bring forward, because it's fairly technical. I do remember 2 years ago, John Davidson and I worked on the online adjustment and the space model, given Lamar's, at the time, presence in the online space and UT Arlington's presence in the online space. Charge 3, I think the commissioner laid it out well, and Emily Cormier provided some data on that, and to me that aligns fairly similarly with charge number 1, so it seems that would be something we could talk about collectively. Charge 4, which is the comprehensive regional proposal that the legislature passed, and as the commissioner said, did not fund. I would think that would be well suited to talk about in a subcommittee format. And then charge 5, which I think is a kind of a more philosophical or long-term kind of thought about student characteristics and the base period. I can see benefit from talking about that in a smaller group, but also in the large group. So I don't know if my other colleagues who reviewed these have some thoughts, or anybody wants to kind of guide any discussion today on it.
This is Susan Brown. I agree with Daniel that 4 and 2 probably ought to go into small groups to come out for recommendations. 5, I do believe is going to be a more long-term. And so I would think that maybe starting the discussion as a whole and then going into the small groups based on where that discussion leads us might be helpful.
Thanks, Susan.
Hi, this is Veronica Mendez. I would agree with Susan on number 5. I think that getting some guideline as a whole, and then if there's detailed information, we can then divide up. But I think it's going to be a long-term discussion. We all said already.
All right. So, I'm assuming we want to limit kind of any subcommittee to 4 or 5 people. I guess no more than that. So with that, if you have interest in serving on a working group on charge 2 or 4, if you could email Jennifer and she'll consolidate that, and then we'll try to try to establish a small group to get that going, and hopefully have something that we can talk about globally at our late September meeting.
This is Lauren Blanchard. Jennifer, would you remind us or remind me of your email address?
Sure, I will. Gonzalez. Oh, am I muted? Are y'all hearing me? Are you hearing me? Okay.
Yes, we are.
Okay, Jennifer.Gonzalez at texas.highered.gov. No. I do think the preference would probably be if people wanted to volunteer for those now, it might get us further down the road for September, if that's possible, since we're all together.
Yes, Jennifer, this is Dr. Hurley at Tarleton State. I would like to serve on the committee for the Comprehensive Regional Universities bill.
And Jennifer, this is Noelle. I would be interested in serving on charge number 2.
And Jennifer, this is Susan, and I would be interested in charge 4.
Jennifer, this is Lauren Blanchard. I am also interested in charge 4 in serving.
Jennifer, this is Emily Deerdorf. I'd be interested in charge 2.
This is Veronica Mendez. I'm interested in charge 2 as well.
This is John Davidson. I'd also be interested in charge 2.
This is Jason Tomlinson. I'd be interested in charge 2. And I think, Jennifer, when you said your email address, you said texas.highered. I think it's highereducation.texas.gov. So
Thank you for correcting that. I was.
We'll send it in the chat.
It was in the the invitation for the meeting notice, so I had to look it up too. But yeah,
It's changed a couple times, so it just caught me off guard.
Well, Jennifer, when you get that, I'll volunteer with their space on any of that. I wasn't counting, so.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that one.
I said I'll volunteer. Once you get a list, if there's any space on either 2 or 4, I'll volunteer to
Okay.
spend some time on
Yeah,
it.
we already have. Yeah, we have 5 on 2 right now. We have 3 on 4. So.
All right. Well, you can put me on 4 if there's space.
Okay.
And I assume Joseph Duran, he'll want to be on number 4 as well. So.
Okay.
And since he's not here to say no.
Yeah. So those are good. Those are good sizes for the committees. I think y'all can move forward.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. So unless we want to talk about the charges more, I guess next on the agenda, we have some tentative dates. The coordinating board, I guess, Jennifer, you're proposing September 22nd, October 27th, November 17th, and then you're holding December 8th and January 5th if needed. But I think the commissioner would like us to have this wrapped up between the Thanksgiving and Christmas break is the vibe I get. So, and I presume the collective group wants to do virtual. I'm in Austin, Texas, so it's not hard for me to get down the street, but I think a few others may prefer it. And any, I guess, probably any discussion on meeting dates, time, and on virtual versus in person?
I'm certainly good with virtual meetings.
Perfect. And then I know I have some information that I'm gonna ask Jennifer and Emily Cormier to put together for our next meeting. And if anybody has some ideas they'd like to send it either to myself or Jennifer, and we'll get that in the queue and then back out to the group.
Daniel, this is Noelle. One question I have, and maybe it's after this meeting, when you see the list of those of us that have volunteered to be on one of the working committees, but do we want to name maybe a lead for each of the working committees to take the lead, maybe through Jennifer, to set up the interim meeting dates for those committees?
Yeah, I say we have Joseph lead number 4. And I don't know if Emily Deerdorf is up for leading number 2, but I'm also indifferent and defer to y'all if you know a better process to do that.
Daniel, this is Emily. I can lead if you want, although I'm not going to have as much time to dedicate to it, at least in the next month. Okay. So if somebody else would like to volunteer.
I don't remember. Yeah.
Daniel, again, this is Noelle. If you'd like me to coordinate setting up those meetings and leading that one, be happy to do so.
That's perfect. Works for me. Anything else we'd like to cover today? I guess hearing none, I guess we're next for adjournment. And do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Lauren Blanchard.
Yes, sir. And then I believe protocol, we would need a second.
This is
Second.
Susan, second.
Susan, thank you. All right. So all in favor, say aye.
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 I'm assuming none opposed, but we'll give them an opportunity. And then if not, we'll be back September 22nd, 10 a.m. virtual. And then Jennifer will coordinate on those working groups. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.